Hello folks, it's Mr. Majewski, and I am here to talk about reform and culture with you, which is a unit that has a lot of impact on the development of the United States, and in particular, some of these reform movements lead to massive major changes in American society. All right, so we're going to get started with it right away. Now, it covers the years 1790 to 1860, which of course means that we are covering something that is going on at the same time that Jacksonian democracy is going on. It's going on at the same time as the development of the mass economy is going on. So all of these things are happening kind of independent from one another, and they're also kind of linked to one another at the same time. They're not happening in a vacuum, they're happening at the same time. So again, this is the unit that we are covering, and these notes are available to you. Of course you have the notes for these, and of course you can follow along with the slides as well on haiku. So again, reform and culture, and again strongly influenced by the Second Great Awakening. Let's get right into it. The Second Great Awakening was a religious movement that re-energizes American religion through the creation of new religious sects, movements, and the conversion of hundreds of thousands of people. So right here and there, it starts sounding a lot like the First Great Awakening. Well, hey, we're going to revive religion. We're going to bring it back into American society again. It's going to create new religions, new sects, new branches. It's going to convert hundreds of thousands of people. But there are actually significant differences. First off, religion was very different than how it had been about 100 years earlier with the First Great Awakening. Remember, the First Great Awakening, 1730s, the Second Great Awakening, about 100 years later. First off, 75% of Americans lived in, attended church regularly at this time. All right, so we are very clearly a religious society. Also, hey, Protestantism was the dominant form of Christianity. It was the dominant form coming into this era, and it's most certainly the dominant form coming out of it. All right, so those things combined, that makes this a slightly different experience than the First Great Awakening, when, remember, folks worried that we were losing our religious way, that people were no longer becoming religious. That's not the case here. The big issue for a lot of folks that were in the religious community was that there were new liberal ways of viewing religion that challenged the old system of thinking. For instance, we had things like deism. Remember, deism was promoted by Thomas Paine. It was supported by Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and many other Enlightenment philosophers. Deism was this idea that really emphasized reason over belief or revelation. It really asked for people to rely on science instead of the Bible. So it wasn't really what we would consider to be a traditional Christian religion. It was a belief system that was really based on science. It was based on what we would call kind of like systems or patterns that existed. Deists believed that the universe operated like a clock. It could be understood that way, and that there were kind of cycles that existed within history and within society. They did not agree with the idea of original sin, which was a Puritan idea, if you remember, a Calvinist idea. They did not believe in the divinity of Christ. So, for instance, this is not a Christian religion whatsoever. They don't even, for instance, view Christ as the Savior, I guess you could say, or as the messenger of God, as traditional Christian faiths did. They believe that the supreme creator, whoever it was, created a knowable universe, and humans had the ability and the capacity for moral behavior and to understand how the universe operated. Obviously, this is a really radical religion, and it really challenged a lot of the traditional Judeo-Christian religions that were out there. Deism was popular during this time. Another popular religion is Unitarianism. It was very much inspired by deism. It was another one that really broke away from Puritanism and the ideas that had been expressed under Puritanism and Calvinism. Believed that God existed in one person, that there was no Holy Trinity, there was no Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They believed that that people were essentially good, that they were not by nature sinners. And they believed that your actions on earth, for your free will, the decisions you made, and your actions on earth, how you benefited other humans, really impacted whether you were getting into heaven or hell. Not, for instance, which group you were born into. These folks really believed what you did during your life impacted whether you would get into heaven. And so that takes us to the Second Great Awakening. Because of deism, because of Unitarianism, there's a reaction by conservative traditional religions against what this was viewed as these radical beliefs, these liberal ideas that were challenging or changing what Christianity meant. Now, this is a much more influential movement than the First Great Awakening was. It has much more significant effects. All right, first off, let's look at some of these general effects. One, you better believe it's going to convert countless souls, probably in the hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people are going to be converted to some of these new faiths. Religion's going to be re-energized into their lives, and they're going to take this religious spirit, they're going to go out and try to improve society with that. Secondly, it shattered many of the existing churches. In many other instances, churches survived the Second Great Awakening, but they were reorganized, which meant that there might be a northern or a southern branch. In addition to that, we have a number of new religious organizations or sects that are going to form during this time as well. And probably the most important impact is C down here on this slide. It inspired new reform movements. People that were affected by the Second Great Awakening decided to go out and they decide to improve society for the better, which meant going out and identifying a problem in society, a societal ill, and then figuring out how you're going to fix that. All right? Now, the religion that we think of with the Second Great Awakening is more like what we would call a spiritual revival. We would have these huge, massive, what were called camp meetings. These were outdoor religious activities or sermons that were provided by a traveling minister. They were attended by thousands of people. They were usually Methodist and Baptist. Those were the organizations that were generally strongest or most influenced by these meetings. And so it's basically like a weekend or an outdoor or a week-long festivity, almost like where you would camp out and you would live the religious experience for a week or longer, where you were exposed to these speeches that were being provided. You lived amongst other folks who were looking to kind of revitalize religion in their life. All right, if you've ever been to like a weekend religious camp, if you've ever been to the thing called the Harvest Fest, for instance, which takes place every year, that's kind of very similar. These revival experiences were very, very common, and they were part of the Second Great Awakening experience. So, hey, these camp meetings, as they were called, they stressed personal conversion. They wanted individuals to convert or be born again. They were generally democratic. What we mean by that is they generally called for greater control by the people over church decisions. They were very emotional. They appealed to emotion. All right, these are sermons that are not intellectual. They are not rational. They're appealing to people's feelings and hearts to try to basically light a fire to revive religion within their lives. All right. Really quickly, please pay attention to this slide right here. This is a famous image that is provided. That kind of shows one of these camp experiences. There's a lot going on here, all right? You have the minister who's probably traveling, who's probably just arrived. And what is he doing? He's speaking up on a kind of a raised platform or a stage. As you can see, he's speaking to hundreds in this instance, maybe even thousands of people that are there specifically to attend his speeches. So this is outside of town. This is in a rural area. You see all the camp tents and all that stuff in the background where people are camping out. And they would basically spend their day being exposed to these fiery, emotion-driven messages. Now, these are not like ominous. They're not doom and gloom. They're usually very hopeful. They're very positive. They want to really try to energize people and get them back into religion again. All right? And as you can see, there's people who are overwhelmed by the power of the messages and the power of God here, right? You can see how there's people that are keeled overall here. Almost like one of those, like when you're watching on Sunday morning, you're watching one of these huge religious sermons on television by these televangelists, right? And people are like, boom, I'm feeling the power of God, and they're falling down and they're tremoring and they're shaking. That's what this was, minus the television, right? Minus the cameras. And so it was a very emotional, it was a very much your personal connection with God. Are you hearing God? And are you being inspired by Him? All right? This was an overhead map of another camp layout. Again, you're going to notice there's a stage. You have all the benches and stuff, the pews for people to sit in. You notice there are churches, good Lord, there are tents in the background that are being constructed, that are being planned as well. So you would camp out in your tent, right? You would stay there overnight, maybe for days or weeks at a time. then you would be exposed to this almost constant medley of different religious speakers who would be up on the stage appealing to you, trying to really light a fire within you, trying to appeal to whatever arguments were you were most receptive to religiously and emotionally. All right. You'll notice, basically, by the way, that you can't really see that very well on this image, but like blacks and whites are separated, men and women are separated as well. All right, so separating people according to social and racial reasons, and the whole goal again is to try to reinvigorate religion, in particular the traditional Christian faith, back into everyday life, to get people more religious, and to get them to go out in society and try to change society based on this religious fervor. Here's another Methodist camp meeting, right? Here's another image. This is an engraving, actually. Again, you see the raised platform where people are speaking to large crowds. And then you can see the tents in the background. Again, this was called the camp meeting. This was kind of constant with the Second Great Awakening. This is what you would expect. All right? Now, we have some individuals you need to know. Probably the most famous of the Second Great Awakening ministers is a guy named Peter Cartwright. All right? So the guys that were the Second Great Awakening ministers were called circuit riders because they would go from camp meeting to camp meeting to camp meeting. They called it riding the circuit, going from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. And then the next year they would go back to these locations again and they would give the same speeches, almost like a yearly occurrence. And so the most famous of these was a Methodist minister. His name was Peter Cartwright. He was a traveling preacher, really, really well known, considered one of the guys really responsible for kick-starting this Second Great Awakening through his efforts through traveling around through these individual camp meetings with groups of people. All right, probably the greatest and the most well-known of the revival preachers is a guy named Charles Grandison Finney. So again, Cartwright is kind of the spark by which the Second Great Awakening starts. Grandison Finney is the most well-known and the one who generally is considered to have achieved the greatest results. He believed in something called earthly perfection. He called it perfectionism. All right. He basically was borrowing from some of the ideas that the Puritans had started. He believed that a perfect society, a perfect religious society could be built. It just took devout and dedicated people in order to create it. All right. He also is going to be one of these guys who's really going to inspire a lot of major reform movements. People who were converted by him, or who he appealed to. Many of these folks are going to be the individuals that are going to go out and try to improve society, fix society, solve some of these societal ills that exist in the period during and after the awakening takes place. All right. You should know that there are really two groups, two churches that benefit more from the Second Great Awakening than any other. These are the Methodist and the Baptist churches. They were very popular in the Midwest and the South. They were popular in rural areas, and these were the areas that were most receptive to these camp meetings. These are generally two religions that do not require a lot of rules or structure. As long as you are born again, as long as you accept God, I guess you could say, back into your life again, you can kind of get a fresh start with these religions. And so even folks who maybe had lost their religious way, who were no longer involved in religion, these two particular faiths appealed to a lot of folks because they didn't have a lot of rules, they didn't have a lot of requirements. As long as you accepted God into your life, you really were embraced within the community, within church. And so they're very popular, especially with folks, again, in rural areas where these camp meetings were taking place. All right? Anyways, those are the two largest prominent Protestant denominations by the mid-1850s. So these are the ones that grow the most. They benefit the most. They get a lot of converts from traditional religions. The Methodists and the Baptists grow mightily. All right? Now, there were some new religious organizations that grew. There were some new sects, as we call them, religious groups. Many of them were founded in what is Western New York. Western New York was known as the Burned-Over District. There were so many camp meetings there, and there were so many what were considered to be hellfire and damnation sermons. So sermons that were really emotion-driven, that were really fiery, that were provided by these circuit riders, that this area was known for its camp meetings. It was known for its religious revival. It was considered kind of the heart of the Second Great Awakening, and it had so much activity they called it the Burned Over District. All right, now we have some religions that form as a result of the Second Great Awakening, some brand new ones that had never existed before by individuals that were fired up by the Second Great Awakening. The first are the Adventists. They called themselves the Millerites. Several 100,000 members, developed by a guy named William Miller. They believed that Christ would actually come back down to earth, and there would be basically a cataclysmic event. There would be like an apocalypse situation. And the Adventists, the Millerites, the believers would be carried off into heaven, and everybody else would kind of be screwed. Now, Miller predicted when it would happen in October of 1844. He basically said that's when the end of the world's going to happen. That's when Christ is going to come back to earth, and he's going to carry us all into heaven, those of us that believe. Obviously, October 22nd, 1844 came and went, and there was no Christ that showed up. And so what Millerites did is they just changed the date. They believe there have been a number of these dates since then where this event would happen. They've yet to happen. But despite this fact, Adventists have grown in popularity. They continue to grow. They are Seventh-day Adventists today, and the movement continues to grow, and it does so all the way up until today as well. All right, so end of the world, Jesus is going to come down, they're going to save the Millerites, and that never actually happened. All right, but the religion grows anyways, and they just kind of pick new dates, years, when they expect this end of world event to take place. All right. This was the Burned Over District. This was upstate New York. You can see Erie Canal in there, which bordered upstate New York, which is the northern part of New York. And as you can see on this slide, you can see how there were a number of, one, religious revivals. Those are the green dots in 1831. We've got Millerite churches that are displayed on this. The orange dots are churches that begin to fight against slavery, which is one of the reforms that Second Great Awakening religions embraced. And then the blue dots there are Mormon churches, which is the other second major church you're going to see form in the Burned Over District in western New York. Now, the Mormons were a second faith that was founded. They were founded by a guy named Joseph Smith. He founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's why they call themselves Latter-day Saints, or the LDS. Their religious text is known as the Book of Mormon. Smith believed that an angel spoke to him directly and told him a long convoluted story, but a story about how one of the lost tribes of Israel had arrived in North America, and that they, the Mormons, were descendants of this lost tribe of Israel. They were controversial. They were persecuted in Ohio. There was opposition to them in Missouri and Illinois, some of the other places where they existed. A lot of this opposition had to do with the fact that they practiced polygamy. One of the things that Joseph Smith believed that this angel had told him was that polygamy for men was okay. They could have multiple wives. And so that's what they did. This created a number of enemies with other groups, with other Americans who thought that these folks were too radical, too extreme. Got to be so bad for Smith that in 1844 he and his brother were murdered in an Illinois town where he had moved most of the Mormons to, over polygamy and over disagreements about Christianity. He was killed, so was his brother. What happens is a guy named Brigham Young takes over, one of the followers of Joseph Smith. Young leads the Mormons across the country all the way to the Western Territories, to what will later be Utah. They then stayed in the Great Salt Lake Valley, which is located in northern Utah. It's beautiful country. And they prospered there. They created a theocracy, which is a religious government, a government based on their religious views. They created a cooperative commonwealth where they cooperated with one another. They shared property. They shared resources a lot of times so that they, the Mormons, prospered. They also, for instance, borrowed irrigation methods from some of the Native Americans and from other Westerners, and they thrived. They developed a very strong agricultural community out west in the Utah area that they dominated. All right, now, eventually, they become so strong that they are prepared to become a state. The problem was they practiced polygamy which went against federal law, national law in this country. And so, in order for them to be admitted into the United States in 1896, they had to agree to formally renounce polygamy. So I know that's one of those stereotypes you still hear some of the time. Mormons, polygamy. That hasn't been the case since 1896. There are a few extreme Mormons that still try to practice it, but the official policy of the Mormon Church after 1896 is polygamy is no more. All right, so again, what we are seeing here, we're seeing the Mormon Trail. The Mormon Trail is green here. And what happens is they're going to lead their followers, led by Brigham Young, out to the Great Salt Lake Valley, and they're going to settle in this area. All right? Now, there are some other trails. There's an Oregon Trail that Americans are taking to get into the Oregon Territory. There's a California Trail as well, which is mostly the Oregon Trail, and then at one point you change directions and you head to California instead. The point here is we're seeing a number of different paths leading west. Some of them for economic opportunity, like California and Oregon. Some of them for religious opportunity, like the Mormons in Utah. And, of course, the Mormon faith is still very strong today in Utah. It's where a large majority of the Mormons are still located. Now, the reality of it is that the Second Great Awakening was especially popular in rural places. It was popular with poorer Americans. It was popular with less educated Americans. So generally speaking, the more educated you were, the wealthier you were, the less affected by these revivals. All right? And so while Baptists and Methodists gained followers during this time, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Congregationalists, the old faiths, the faiths that had survived the First Great Awakening, they were the ones that were less influenced by this. They did not gain as many new members, new converts, and their significance decreases. The less prosperous, the less learned or educated you were, the more deeply affected you were by the Second Great Awakening. Methodists and Baptists are strong in the Midwest and the South, in less educated places with farmers. Not surprisingly, they're the folks who benefited or who embraced these religious ideas the most. All right. Now, one last thing. One of the effects of the Second Great Awakening is it led to reform movements. So the most famous is going to be abolition. The problem is that many of these churches were split. The northern branch of the church would support abolition, the southern branch would not. So it's going to lead to a number of these churches splitting into northern and southern halves down the road. The Baptist church is going to split into a northern and a southern Baptist church based on whether they supported slavery or not. The Methodists, the Presbyterians are going to break as well. All right, so as a result of this movement, where people are encouraged to go out and pursue reforms, some of these churches were actually affected to the point where they split in two based on whether you were a northern version of that or a southern version of that, based on your position on slavery. It's a demonstration to us the significance of slavery and how oftentimes the slavery issue could even influence or affect the religious views that you and your church members might have. All right? Thoughts, comments? Well, you're going to have to hold on. Our next major issue here is, now that we know what the Second Great Awakening was, this religious revival, the second great religious revival that occurred in American society, now we need to see the effects of it, because the effects of it were so much more extreme than they were with the first. The Second Great Awakening inspired this ideal of perfectionism in society, that we could create perfect religious societies, and that people had to go out and fight for this. They had to go out to fight to reform society, to improve it, to make it better, to eliminate what people would consider to be societal ills. All right? And so the Second Great Awakening leads to this incredible era of reform that's going to break out in this country as people are fired up. They're energized by this religious revival, by born-again evangelical religions. And they want to go out there and now try to create a real society based on these religious ideals that would perfect it, that would make it better. It harkens back to the old idea of Puritanism and perfectionism. The Puritans were going to create this perfect religious society. People believe, once again, that this is a possibility. And so it's up to individuals to get out there and try to improve or change some sort of ailment or issue in this country. A lot of this is based on the fact that a lot of folks were fearful of some of the changes happening in society. They felt like technology and some of these things were happening so quickly that traditional society was being changed, and that if they would go out and try to reform and fix some of the problems, it would show the importance of religion, again, to everyday Americans. Women were especially vital in this movement. They were strongly affected by the Second Great Awakening and They really led a lot of these reform movements. Now, this is a laundry list of the major issues here, right? The major reform movements that took place. Now, the biggest of them all, the granddaddy of the reform movements, is abolition of slavery. So important, in fact, it's going to get its own set of notes here that you're going to cover during the break. So we need to know that's the most important, but we also need to know that it's not something we cover in these particular notes. Now, letter B, temperance. That is something we cover. Temperance is another major reform movement. That's really just where you agree to temper your alcohol consumption, which means to reduce or eliminate it. Women's rights is probably the other major issue other than abolition. Some huge gains here, though the biggest gains come later in American history. Educational reform. We're going to reform public schools. Yay! We're going to reform mental hospitals or prisons. Yay! We are going to try to eliminate debtors' prisons during this era. Yay! And lastly, I don't know if this is a major reform, but we're going to see the development of a number of wilderness utopias, most of which Mr. Bajewski would simply describe as weird, but whatever. So again, a totally wicked elephant made people devour worms. Ow! All right, what a great memory device for reform. I know when I think of abolition and women's rights and education and temperance, I think a totally wicked elephant made people devour worms. Let's get to temperance. Temperance. Temperance occurs because, well, people believed that we were an alcoholic republic, that we had turned into an alcoholic country. A lot of folks blamed immigrants coming into the country for their beer and alcohol consumption. They believed we had turned into an alcoholic society, that alcohol abuse was rampant. And the reality of it was, it probably was pretty bad. There definitely was a lot of alcoholism in this country. It decreased workplace efficiency. It did cause injuries in the workplace when people showed up drunk or maybe a little hungover or whatever. Women and children were especially susceptible to abuse by violent alcoholics. And so the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826. Of course, the goal with temperance is to encourage people to drink less. It was formed by a guy named Lyman Beecher. It had over 1,000 groups that eventually formed it around the country. Again, they urged organizations to give up alcohol. They organized children's club to encourage parents not to drink. One of their most famous pieces of work, well, first off, I'm just going to kind of take you through this because it's really good. A couple of images here. The Drunkard's Progress is probably one of their most famous contributions, the Temperance Society. So what it shows is it shows a person, and there's 10 steps from, their first drink all the way to death and misery, right? So we've got, for instance, a glass with friends is step one. Then the next step is, now they're having one to keep the cold out, alrighty? Which means now they're finding reasons to have a drink, right? Now it's a drink by himself, right? So each step, right, is basically like, see, once you have one drink, it's easier to get to the next step and the next step and the next step. Step 4 is, drunk and riotous. This is where he's getting drunk and getting into physical confrontations, right? Step 5, right, as you can see, it's called the summit has been attained, right? This person is now drinking all the time. They're hanging out with their friends and poor wifey and child at home, right? Left alone because the guy has gotten too drunk. He's turned into an alcoholic. You'll notice like his home is not looking very good. It looks like it's in trouble. His farmland has been destroyed as well because he's no longer there to care for it. Step 6, poverty and disease, right? Now, as you can see, the longer you drink, the more likely you are, they say, to head to poverty and disease, right? And step 7 is where you have been kind of forgotten by your friends, right? Step 8, you're desperate and you're willing to use crime in order to get money to buy more alcohol. And then step 9, death by suicide, right? So the message here is be careful. That first step you take, that first drink you have can lead to all of these effects down the road if you're not careful. That's how alcohol works, right? They had another one. This was very famous as well. This is a great little story here through a set of slides, right? The bottle is brought out for the first time. The husband induces his wife, just take a drink, all right? Yeah, I mean, it's a drink, just one drink, right? Then the next scene, right? He's discharged from his employment, so he got fired from his job for being drunk. They have to pawn their clothes to supply the bottle, all right? So they're pawning their clothes now, and yet what are they buying with that? They're buying booze. Meanwhile, the family suffers. Stage 3. An execution sweeps off the greater part of their furniture. Their furniture got repossessed. It got taken by the company because they weren't paying their bills on it. What do? They comfort themselves with the bottle. So the family's struggling more because of this alcohol, right? But what are the parents doing? They're just drinking more and more. All right, looking for excuses. Scene 4, they're no longer able to work because, well, they're alcoholics. They're driven by poverty into the streets to beg, and when they beg and they get money, what do they do with it? Well, unfortunately, they buy alcohol. All right, step 5. It's cold, misery, and want destroy their youngest child, so their youngest child dies, right? From cold, from misery, from, not hunger. They console themselves with the bottle to try to make themselves feel better, right? So this is kind of a sad story, right? Scene 6. There are quarrels, there's violence. Those are the natural consequences, this cartoon says, of the frequent use of the Bible. So now dad is beating up on mom and maybe the kids as well because he's a drunken, riotous alcoholic. All right? Scene 7, the husband, in a state of furious drunkenness, kills his wife with the instrument of their misery, which means he bangs her over the head with a bottle of alcohol. All right? Of course, this has gotten very tragic very quickly. And the last scene in this story, the bottle's done its work. It's destroyed the infant and the mother. They're both dead. It's brought the son and the daughter to vice, which means, they're committing crimes now. The implication is she's a prostitute. And it sent them to the streets, and it has left the father a hopeless maniac who's gone crazy, and he's committed to an asylum. All right, so the moral of the story there, kids, is, according to the American Temperance Society, don't drink. Drink less. Otherwise, this might be you. And their message is this is happening in this country. It's happening to a great many people. And so we need to try to reduce the amount of alcohol that exists. All right? American Temperance Society, Lyman Beecher. These are some of his famous works. There's also a really famous book that's written. It's called 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. It's a story of a bar that opens up in a small town. And within 10 days, the entire town has been destroyed by this bar, by the alcohol and by the consumption. It was one of the great bestsellers of the 1850s, and again, really drew attention to this cause. Now, there were two major strategies with temperance reformers during this era. One was temperance. That was simply drink less, try to promote people drinking less, all right, to encourage them to drink less or not at all. The other major strategy was something called prohibition. That's where you make alcohol illegal. That's a more extreme method, right, to try to just eliminate alcohol from everyday life. The very first prohibition law occurred in Maine. It was called the Maine Law of 1851. It was also known as the Dow Law, named after this man, Neil Dow, who was responsible for getting it passed. Now, by 1857, 12 states had passed prohibition laws. But during the 1850s and after, a lot of these laws were overturned as more immigrants came into the country, Germans and Irish, who accepted alcohol as part of their culture and everyday lives. There was enough momentum to overturn a lot of these prohibition laws that had been inspired by the Second Great Awakening. That being said, what were the major impacts or effects of the Second Great of temperance? Well, one was there was way less drinking by women, especially, than there had been previously, and there was less consumption of alcohol, of hard liquor. Now, in the 1820s and 30s, the average adult drinks over 7 gallons of alcohol in this country. That is a lot of booze. But by the 1840s and 50s, thanks to the temperance movement, that amount had dropped to a much more moderate 2 gallons of alcohol per year. All right, so a lot less drinking per person, per capita, especially amongst women. Temperance does play a role in that. All righty, now let's get to our second major reform movement. That's the women's rights movement. Gender lines had been very strict during most of the 19th century, during the 1800s. All right. The market revolution separated men from women. Women were in the home. Men oftentimes were working in factories or they were working outside of the home. Women were viewed in negative ways. They were viewed as emotionally and physically weak, as dependent on men. They were also viewed as more moral, as more artistic, as more refined, and men were seen as more like brutes and providers. All right? Anyways, if you remember, during the American Revolution, the idea of Republican motherhood developed. That was the idea, if you remember, that women, and this was dominant all the way till the Market Revolution. Women were keepers of the house. They were keepers of society. They had special responsibilities to be in the home and to raise the children, because it was their job to turn the next generation of young children into productive citizens, loyal, patriotic, respectful citizens who would contribute to the next generations of the Republic. So the message there was women are specially trained for this, and it's a woman's responsibility to be in the home to raise the children. Then, during the Market Revolution, during this early 1800 period, we see the role of women really change into something that's called the cult of domesticity. This was something that was very popular with middle-class Americans, all right? And the idea was that a woman's home, again, it reinforced the idea that the woman was the angel of the home, that she belonged in the home, that there were two spheres of society, that there was a man's sphere outside of the home, and his job was to provide for the family and to work and to engage in public affairs, and then there was a private sphere of society of the home, and that was the woman's domain. That was where the woman dominated and ruled, and it was her job to keep the perfect home and to take care of the family and to kind of cater to any needs that they possibly have. Now, some women break away from this role. Some women challenge this idea that their responsibility was to be in the home, to live a private life. These women that challenged this idea become our first women's rights reformers. So they're challenging this idea, a woman's responsibility is in the home. They have to be a homemaker, a housewife. They have to be the angel of the home, and it's a man's domain outside of the home. All right? And these are the women who are really going to fight for women's rights and for, in particular, women's suffrage. Now, hey, they also participated in other movements like abolition. They also participated in temperance. And in fact, the women's rights movement is going to be overshadowed by the abolition movement. And so it doesn't achieve the gains it otherwise might have if more women had been focused on this issue and only this issue. All right? But you do need to know these names. We start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's considered the leader of the early female reformers, the early women's rights leaders. She urges equality for women across the board. All right. She really fights for a woman's right to sue, a woman's right to get a divorce, and a woman's right to own property. You'll notice there's nothing there mentioning the right to vote at that time. All right. So equality, legal rights, own your own property, be able to make it easier to get divorces. All right. She specifically focused on something called femme covert, which was she wanted to see ended, where a husband took control of all the wife's possessions when they got married. Okay. Next up is Lucretia Mott. She and Cady Stanton were really the keys. They were the ones that organized what becomes known as the Seneca Falls Convention, the start of the women's rights movement. Next up is Susan B. Anthony, another militant lecturer and fighter for women's rights. It's Stanton, Mott, and Anthony that are really the three lionesses, the three pioneers, the three trailblazers of women's rights. You need to know all three of them as really the organizers and creators of the basic women's rights movement and the Seneca Falls Convention. Some lesser-known people, but you need to know them. The Grimke sisters are women's rights supporters. They are located in the South. They were also abolitionists. That's what makes them unique. They were Southerners, women's rights reformers, and abolitionists. Two things that we generally didn't see as much of in the South. All right, and then Lucy Stone. She is a women's rights leader. She's an abolitionist. She's very radical. She creates women's only suffrage organizations, so she didn't believe men should be part of the movement. She, for instance, does not take her husband's name when she gets married. Other women who followed in her path were simply known as Lucy Stoners. There were others as well. There was a lady named Amelia Bloomer who popularized kind of short skirts and pants. Those were known as bloomers. It was fashionable for women's rights advocates to wear those during that period. All right. Anyways, these women, especially the first three there, Stanton, Mott, and Anthony, helped to organize this, the Seneca Falls Convention. This is considered to be the start of the modern women's rights movement. It was a convention of men and women in Seneca Falls, New York. It was organized by Stanton and Mott, and women and men attended. What they did was they put together something called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was based off the Declaration of Rights, and it rewrote it from a woman's perspective. It stated that all men and women are created equal. They demanded women's suffrage as part of this Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention. They wanted property ownership for women, and they wanted increased child custody rights for women in the event of divorce. And so these are basic demands, but they were important demands to these women who, at that point, did not have these freedoms in society. Now, they were generally frowned upon. They were viewed as too extreme, too excessive. The mainstream press and many churches opposed them, thought they were too radical, too extreme, that they were redefining the role of women in a way that made many men uncomfortable in this country. Now, the other thing I mentioned to you already, women's rights really gets overshadowed by abolition. All right, but that being said, and so the greatest gains are going to be to abolition during this time, not to women's rights. Although, hey, we do see some benefits at this time. Prior to the Civil War, women were admitted to college more gradually than ever before. We do start to see women have greater property rights. We see an end to femme covert in many western and southern states, even in New York. And we do see women have states pass laws that gave women better access to work, a right to work, and to be able to own businesses that were separate from their husband. Now, hey, these are not the major goals women wanted, right? But most of these major gains for women are going to come a little bit later on. If it weren't for the efforts of these women, these trailblazers, these efforts would have never been realized. All right, next up. Next reform movement is education. Public education is what we're talking about. Reformers really see public education as the key. They see it as the key to educate children, to instill Protestant morality and Protestant ethics into their lives, and to reinforce patriotism and Republican values in everyday life. All right? Now, the pioneer, the most important reformer is a guy named Horace Mann, right? He argued that education was more important than any other reform in American history, that we needed education if we were going to achieve other reforms, if we were going to achieve greatness, because an educated society, he thought, was a better prepared society. And so he and others fought for what was known as tax-supported public education in the East and the West. They want to see this entire country provide public education paid for with taxpayer dollars for every child. All right. Now, hey, this was a popular movement at the time. A lot of workers, laborers in the eastern cities wanted this for their children to hopefully break the cycle of poverty that they were stuck in. A lot of Western farmers and workers wanted this as well for their children. And a lot of wealthier Americans actually supported this as well because they thought a more educated society would be more moral, which meant less crime, less alcohol abuse, that education would be the key to fix a lot of society's ills and to make us a little bit more moral and religious society in the future. All right. Ultimately, we see a number of really significant gains in education. We do see the availability of education much, much more than ever before. There was some resistance to required education, I will say that, despite the efforts of Horace Mann and Catherine Beecher, who helped to train a lot of teachers, women teachers. There was some resistance. Some working class families still wanted their kids to work. Elementary education was generally provided. Secondary, junior high and high school education was not. Slaves were still forbidden from reading and writing in many places. And even free blacks in the North oftentimes had a hard problem attending school as well. One other thing, a lot of Catholics enrolled their kids in private Catholic schools, which many Protestants and education reformers worried was somehow corrupting the nation and turning us into a more Catholic society. All right, this is a famous image of the one-room schoolhouse. A lot of teachers are trained. They were usually young women. Teaching was a woman's work. And Catherine Beecher was the woman who was responsible for really helping to teach hundreds of women who would then go out throughout the Midwest and the South and teach classes in one-room schoolhouses to all grade levels at the same time. All right, so this was kind of the standard for how many kids during this time experienced education, where all the kids in the area went to one school, one-room schoolhouse, with one teacher who kind of instructed all of them at separate parts of the room. All right. Now, again, we've already hit on Noah Webster. We should know who he is, but obviously he plays a big role as well in helping to promote education. It's his books, it's his spellers that are used by kids in many classrooms. We know William McGuffey, his McGuffey Readers, also very significant in helping to spread literacy and basic education to America's youth. All right. Now, higher education lagged behind. It does lead the Second Great Awakening to many new, small, denominational, which meant religious, colleges that formed throughout the South and the West. These are small. These are not state-run. They were private schools. And a lot of these really focused on the reforms that the Second Great Awakening encouraged. So some of the great successes in higher education, we do start to see some women's colleges emerge to educate women so that they can go out and try to reform or improve society. Emma Willard, for instance, establishes the Troy Female Seminary, which was like a nunnery for women. Oberlin College became the first college in America to allow women and men to attend. It also was the first college that accepted free blacks as well. Lastly, we had a really popular movement during this time called lyceums. Lyceums were basically traveling lectures by famous scientists, authors, writers, historians. They would go around, they would lecture to groups of people. So if you lived on the western frontier, you didn't have access to literature, or to schools, or to libraries. The lecture series would come to you. These famous Americans would tour around. They would give famous speeches to groups or to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to them. It was designed to encourage more independent thought. It was designed to encourage new ideas. The Lyceum movement was very popular with many well-known Americans. Mark Twain was a big believer in the Lyceum movement. All right. Other reform movements. We've got prison and mental health reform. So mental health reform is really the role of one woman. Her name is Dorothea Dix. All right. And in fact, old Dorothea Dix should have an extra O there. There we go. Dorothea Dix was a woman that was inspired by the Second Great Awakening to go out and improve society. She identified mental health facilities were in terrible shape. We had very few of them. Most mental health facilities did not focus on treatment. They focused on punishment, on imprisonment. If somebody was mentally ill, they were basically locked up. The key was thrown away, and these people were separated from their families for the rest of their lives. So what she did was she went around and she reported on the horrible conditions there. That they were basically prisons, that they were basements in some instances, or poorhouses where the mentally ill were kept. Because of her efforts, conditions in many mental health facilities improved. People started to actually focus on rehabilitation instead of imprisonment and punishment. 15 states created new mental health asylums and mental hospitals to try to help folks that were mentally ill rather than just lock them up like traditional prisoners. All right. Speaking of prisoners, there was also prison reform during this time. The shift occurred in prisons as well. They start to give prisoners religious services and religious material in the hopes that they would convert and adopt a more religious Protestant lifestyle. The focus of prisons really shifted from punishment to rehabilitation to try to improve folks, to make them better members of society so that they would go out and they would contribute to society with work or in other ways. Lastly, a lot of debtors' prisons were finally outlawed or eliminated, or at least reduced during this era. That was another positive reform movement that started as a result of the Second Great Awakening. All right? Let's get to these wilderness utopias because they are always, well, quite interesting. So, what we see is a number of religious reforms that are going to break out during this time. and religious utopias. These are organizations that formed religious communities, usually in the wilderness, to try to create what they considered to be a perfect society. They believed that American society was corrupt, that it was too far gone, that there was no hope for it, and that we had to kind of start over by creating small communities in the wilderness that would eventually turn into larger communities that would be models by which American society would conduct itself in the future. So we start with some of the famous ones. A lot of these folks who formed these communities are upset with, the materialism in society, industrialization. They thought that things were happening too quickly, that the traditions and the conservative religions of the United States were about to be gone unless something drastic was done. The first was called New Harmony. It was founded in 1825 in Indiana. About 1,000 people lived there. It was formed by a guy named Robert Owen. It was a communitarian society, so everything really was shared by the community. There was no individual property. They formed the first kindergarten, public kindergarten. They formed the first free public school for all children. They formed the first public library. All of these were based on the idea that everybody in that community could share them together. This was a very popular idea during this time with these wilderness utopias. All right? It didn't last long. They ran out of money, not surprisingly, because they're offering all of these things for free. And eventually, New Harmony, it went away. Now, another famous wilderness utopia was called Brook Farm. This was created by famous transcendentalists. It was another cooperative community where they shared property and worked together for the common good. There were a lot of really famous American transcendentalists that spent time there. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, all spent some time there. They had a fire at the farm. It burned down the barn they had just created. They ran out of money. They had to shut it down. The Oneida community or colony was another famous religious wilderness utopia. This one was a little bit more radical. Oneidas believed that the second coming of Christ had already occurred. All right? And so to them, they were trying to create a new type of society based on what they considered to be their version of perfectionism, the perfect society. They were much more radical. They believed and practiced free love. So you were not committed to any individual spouse. You could basically engage in sexual relations with anybody that was a member of the colony at any time. They practiced birth control at a time when that was considered radical or unusual. Usually those birth control methods were really primitive. Alrighty. They also did something called eugenics. They selected parents for children. They basically pick somebody and say, hey, maybe you're the tallest, you're the smartest, we're going to put you two together, have a baby. You're the best looking, you're the strongest, we're going to put you together and you're going to have a baby. So they kind of pre-selected who would procreate and who would have children together so that they could create future generations of smarter, stronger, more talented, more capable people. So they're really messing with, I guess you could say, kind of genetics. They didn't believe in the traditional form of love. They basically believed in the communal idea of love and sexual relations. All right? They cared for children communally, so everybody cared for the children together. They were very sexually equal. Women and men were not treated differently. Oftentimes, they interacted with one another. Sometimes their clothing styles were actually very similar to one another. They would wear black and white, for instance. The one thing about Oneida is they were more successful than the previous ones because they were excellent at making silver products, silver steel traps, silver plates. Oneida silver was considered very prized, top-notch, top quality, and so they were able to sell their silverwares, and they were able to keep the colony going for over 30 years. When other colonies around them were dying out, when other wilderness utopias could not survive financially. Another famous group here are the Shakers. They were another community society, communistic society with shared property, shared possessions, no individual ownership. They believed Christ's return was imminent. They were the longest living of all of these sects that began. They first were formed in 1774. They lasted all the way till the 1940s. They too were very extreme. They had 20 religious communities. They had 6,000 members at their peak. They believed in sexual equality for men and women. They were opposed to marriage and free love. They were a celibate society, so they did not engage in sexual relations. Men and women did not. It was considered to be kind of like a sin. So not only are they opposed to marriage, they're opposed to free love. They believed the only way to achieve real equality in society was to eliminate sex altogether. They were very simplistic. They wore very simple clothing. Men wore black and white. Women wore white dresses. They had simple architecture, simple furnishings. They did not engage in any sort of extravagant lifestyle. It was all about living as simple and celibate a life as possible. Now you might ask, how the heck did they grow? How did they attract new members? They would go to orphanages and they would adopt kids at the orphanage at a young age, and then that would be the next generation of their quote-unquote children. And so that's how they were able to last for close to 200 years. All right. The Amana community, another perfect society, believed that the millennium was near, similar to Millerites. They were considered, they didn't last long, but they did produce a lot of goods that were then sold that are still around all the way up till today. All right. Of course, nobody was more successful at creating a wilderness utopia and turning it into a full-fledged religion. And a popular and successful one is the Mormons. I mean, the Mormon faith grew massively. It's still around today. It's a strong faith in this country that continues to grow. It's really the only wilderness utopia or society founded from the Second Great Awakening that survived and actually prospered as a result. All right, now last thing, changing American family. Boy, does American family change. All right. Women are going to increasingly challenge their inferior status during this time. Because remember, when women were married, they generally left their jobs, whatever jobs they had had prior to that, and they became homemakers, housewives. All right. Remember, this was expected of them. This was the dominant belief during this time, this cult of domesticity, that a woman's role was in the home, that was where she did her best work, that when she got married, if you were married and you were not in the home, if you were not a housewife, people looked at you and judged you, and they judged your husband and they judged your family. What is wrong with her? What is wrong with him that he would allow that to take place? All right? The idea was women had a great deal of moral power and authority in their families, but publicly the man made all decisions and engaged the outside world. And folks, there were a number of magazines, of women's journals, of women's books that re-emphasized this. There were women's magazines that developed in the 1800s. The most famous was something called Godey's Lady's Book, which basically promoted this idea that a woman needed to be in the home. It glorified the home life, and it really it challenged or criticized women who went out and tried to reform society, tried to improve society in the public world. All right. It was very popular. We got some images of Godey's Lady's Book. So again, here you see the woman being dressed, and you see how she's like perfectly made up. She's in these extravagant gowns. This is how she was supposed to kind of be at home for her husband when he got home and for the family, right? So a woman has a special responsibility to be at home and to prepare herself and make herself up. These are almost like, Godey's Lady's Book was like a Cosmopolitan or one of those sorts of magazines for women who were at home operating as housewives. Here's another one. You have women that are anxiously awaiting their husband's return, right? At the end of the day, you see how they're perfectly made up. They are dressed to the nines, they are perfectly made up, and they're anxiously awaiting their husband's arrival so that they can take care of him when he gets there. Here's another of a woman that's perfectly dolled up in her home, right? She's ready to entertain or she's ready to take care of her hubby. Look at those furs down there, right? My God, that's like freaking creepy. Oh my gosh, look at that. Look at that. Holy moly, that's a dress and a half. So these are supposed to be like fashion trends that women could engage in order to kind of be at their best when their husband returned from a hard day's work. All right. Probably the most famous supporter of this cult of domesticity was Catherine Beecher. Now, I mentioned her earlier. She was a major advocate for public education. She thought that all education should be taught by women teachers, unmarried young women. And then, when women, got married, right, they oftentimes, according to her, should abandon those teaching jobs and move back into the home again and become the mom and the housewife. Now, hey, she also called on inventors and innovators to improve life for women in the home, to try to make things easier for them, to try to develop labor-saving inventions that might help them. Usually this just meant more work for women. All right, so anyways, Catherine Beecher does some good by training women to be teachers, but in the same sense is reinforcing some of these notions that a woman's role is in the home. Lastly, folks, we start to see other changes in the family, not just women challenging their roles in society. We start to see that most marriages become based now on love for the first time. They weren't arrangements between the families, between the parents. For the first time, marriages start to be based on love. We start to see families become much more close-knit, affectionate, loving of one another. That had not been the case previously, when many marriages were arranged, when maybe marriages involved people that didn't necessarily love one another or have strong feelings. We notice that family sizes start to grow smaller during this time. In 1800, the average woman had 6 kids. It's going to be less than 5 by 1900. And in many instances, for certain groups, especially kind of like educated women, the number could be even half of that. All right, so women are having way less kids, which means they're devoting more time to themselves and their education, their jobs, rather than be, I guess you could say, kind of reduced into one role, which is the mom and the creator of children. All right. We also start to see more children. Oh, by the way, contraception is one of the reasons why as well. We start to see more children-centered families, where children become the center of the family. A lot of the punishments that were considered abusive previously are gotten rid of. The emphasis is to shape children, not necessarily to punish them or to harm them. Children were raised to be more independent. They were raised to be moral individuals. And more importantly, dad is more around in the picture than ever before with the children. And parents would come home and they would spend greater time with their children when they were off of work. So we see more of a family life start to develop, where kids become more important. Smaller families, closer knit families, where all members of the family are kind of home together. Kind of home is a sanctuary, I guess you could say, for the family and family life. Here we go. Here's a Sargent family, right? You see dad there, actively engaged with the daughters, with the kids, right? We see 4 children here with mom. As you can see, they're kind of working together to raise the kids, right? Rather than dad being in one room doing his own thing and mom taking care of all 4 kids on their own. Also some birds in the background, right? They got some pet birds, for instance, for the kids. This is a freaking awesome picture. It's the family with the dad and the son's playing with the dog, and everybody's together kind of in one room playing and hanging out and kind of interacting with one another. There's mom with the kids, there's dad here, there's the animal, there's the boys playing. It looks like a family environment, like a family room. What's a super trip about this is, look at that. Look at that like mirror/portrait in the background. It's a mirror image of the image, alrighty? So it's like a picture trapped in a picture that we are looking at. It's not far out. All right, let's look at this one. Ooh, this is like the American Horror Story family version. This is a family portrait captured by a daguerreotype, which is an early camera. And again, what are we seeing here? We're seeing husband with wife and the 3 daughters there, all kind of close-knit and kind of hanging out together and interacting with one another. We have that eerie-looking freaky bird in the background that looks like a raven or something like that, but whatever. This is like the Addams Family version of this era. Regardless, all right, all three of these families. Look at these. Family time. Yay! All right. Lastly, frontier life experience really dominates American character during this time. We're going to see more individualism, more focus on equality. Alexis de Tocqueville is an author. He writes a famous book about democracy in America where he talks about how individual and equality really were prized in the United States. You know, they talked about how Easterners were more refined, Westerners were a little more crude and rough around the edges. There was more democracy on the frontier, all right? There was greater equality on the frontier. Men were able to vote more easily there. States' rights and localism. There was a lot of patriotism, a lot of nationalism. Go ahead and forget this Frederick Jackson Turner part here at the bottom. Not something that we need to know as part of this unit. That's it, folks. I'm signing out. Mr. M, Reform and Culture. I tried to make it 55 minutes. I could only make it an hour and 5. That's the best I could do. Have a wonderful, wonderful night and study hard.